Good morning. This is Jason Dean live from Film Fanatic headquarters. It is a Wednesday morning, about 10:20. Nice rainy overcast day. Good day for movies. It's interesting people's how different every now and then that comes up, and it's something I think about how people's habits around, say, film watching or times of the day or times during the weekend, how different they are for people. I've been as much of a as much as I love movies, I don't usually watch movies during the day. I always typically always watch movies at night. I usually watch at least one or two movies a night. Occasionally I'll watch like sometimes I'll start a TV series that I've heard about or maybe I'll buy. I don't really do any streaming like I've talked about. I used to use Netflix back in the day, but I don't know. It just became. It felt like it was, and it's cool to have an abundance of content and things to choose from. But after a while, it felt it just for me, and it again, it's just my own personal opinion. It just felt like it was kind of impersonal. I'd rather go to you know, a place, a physical place, and I'm kind of I'm into like the tactile things. I like actual books. I like films or things that I can hold in my hand. And I'm also, my favorite one of my favorite books is High Fidelity, and it's a great book, and it was a really great movie that they made that book into with John Cusack. And I'm always, and that's centered around a guy who like runs a record store. So I love that aspect of the interaction with the business owners. You might strike up a relationship, but it's that exchange of ideas, and it's in person, and it's personable. So that's why I go to Opera House Video. I don't really do the streaming thing. I felt like after I had Netflix back when it was still like kind of in its early stages, but after a while it just felt just really impersonal and kind of cold, and I was missing that human experience as far as the exchangement, going to a physical place, seeing the artwork of a particular movie or even a CD. Same, I have that same feeling about streaming, and and then a big thing for me now over time has been the difference in quality. There's a lot of I don't really know about the technology per se that's used for streaming, but I noticed there is a much different ratio or bit ratio rate for streaming as opposed to if you have a physical copy of a DVD or a movie or even a CD for that matter. And I feel like there is definitely some kind of method of where everything is really compressed. So the quality for me most of the time isn't as great. I notice for especially the picture and the sound. I think it's gotten better. One recent movie I saw that was and it was exclusively made on Hulu for their company, which is a streaming service. But they, now a lot of these companies are creating their own films and greenlighting these film projects, which I think in one way, in a lot of ways, it's really great because now all of these filmmakers have more avenues to be backed, to be financially backed to have their visions come to fruition. One movie I saw recently, fairly recently, was the new Hellraiser, which I really liked a lot. That was one of the first movies I saw where it was like, fully, exclusively just on the streaming shot for that platform. It would have been awesome to have seen that on the big screen. But I noticed that after a while, it was impressive, but I still missed the film experience. And I think it would have been even more, to a degree, gritty if it was shot, say, maybe on film or shown in a format of where it was shown on a big screen and the ratio wasn't quite as clear as it is in that format, but it did feel a little bit compressed. But the quality was better, and I feel like technology will get better for those things. But again, it's just a pet peeve of mine that I have. So, but it is interesting with people's movie habits. I typically always watch, a movie at night. I usually like to watch a movie to kind of unwind from the day. Whether it's whatever I have going on the day during the day. If I have a particularly busy day, or I'm just kind of taking it easy, or doing whatever. To me, that's the ultimate way of just kind of slowly chilling out and unwinding at the end of the day. I've always kind of been that way. I don't usually watch movies during the day. I know lots of people, if they have a day off, they'll watch movies during the day, or they'll sit around with their family and watch movies. And it's usually kind of a social thing that way. I typically watch, I do watch movies with friends. Most of the time, I watch movies here by myself. And it's funny because a lot of the times because I think of film in a different way than probably a lot than maybe your average person. I prefer it a lot of the times in viewing a new film to watch it by myself, just because I feel like I can kind of absorb it a little bit more. There's no distractions per se, but I can kind of make my own opinion. Usually at the end of it, it's a little bit easier. It's usually easier for me to kind of for me to digest the film. And if it's a film I've seen before, or a film I've seen multiple times, it doesn't bother me at all to. I actually enjoy watching or sharing that movie to other friends or people, and watch it with a group of people. Occasionally, when that happens, my favorite experience though is going to a theater. That's my ultimate. That's where I love it the most. And it's that is obviously with a larger group of people, but there's something about that experience that for me is what it's all about. So I haven't been to the movies in a while. I'm kind of craving to go. The last movie I really wanted to see in the theater, but I wasn't. Kind of missed out, and some things got in the way schedule wise. I really wanted to see Pearl in the theater, but it didn't happen. But I did see it recently on DVD, and I did a show on that series, new trilogy by Ty West, and I thought it was a tremendous movie. So overall, that's kind of how I kind of operate. I remember reading an interview with the actor George Clooney a few years ago. And he's been a pretty famous actor now for quite a few years. And then I don't know, maybe about 10 years ago or so, he started to get into he became a director, and he's put out quite a few movies, and some of his movies I think are actually pretty good. I think he's got a good skill and a really good vision as a director. But I remember seeing an interview with him where he said that it sounded like his education that he got from film was as a director was not really necessarily from a schooled place. Like obviously all of his experience as an actor, but he kind of attributed a lot of his way of adapting or adopting various techniques as far as lighting and pacing of a story, how the placement of the camera. He more or less attributed it to his habit of just being an avid movie watcher, and he would sit and process a lot of these movies, sit through them and enjoy them, but take notes to a degree. And he kind of learned from that school of just watching movies. And I thought that was pretty interesting. But he has this thing where he watches a movie every night. He watches one movie every night, and I thought that was pretty cool. So anyway, today's show is about a really is a movie that I've been actually really wanting to get to for quite a long time. I've had this film for maybe a couple of years now. Or I should say a little less, maybe a year. And it's a movie that I had heard about probably the last 3 or 4 years. I kept hearing about this movie. And originally I'd seen this film that later on realized it was a remake of this film. And that movie is the great and glorious The Toolbox Murders. This is one of the, I think, one of the best horror exploitation movies ever. It's super sleazy. It's really gory. It's got a really great story, really great ending. Really, it's got this really great plot twist to it. To me, it almost reminds me. For me, it almost has a like giallo kind of feel, where it has an element of mystery to it. There's a lot of interesting plots plots and twists and turns in the narrative of the story. And it's a mystery movie too. I feel like, especially towards the end of the film, when it's revealed who this killer is. So in that regard, it definitely reminds me of like an early '70s kind of giallo film. Those are like the hallmarks or tropes of a classic kind of giallo film. But it's super gory. It's super sleazy. And I again, this was I've only seen this movie one time, which is wild. It came out in 1978, and it again it's totally holds up to the test of time. It's just such a classic movie. I mean, the artwork is just so great. I mean, you can't beat that. Again, that's one of the allures for me for a lot of these classic films from the 70s and 80s and 60s. Just the artwork, and just they're just I don't know, they're just so awesome. But it was directed by Dennis Donnelly. Music was composed by George Deaton, and it came out in 1978. And it stars Cameron Mitchell, Pamela Ferdin, Wesley Tim Donnelly, Faith McSwain, Annetta Cressette, and Nicholas Bove. And it's funny, the history that I have with this film. Again, I'd seen a movie that was also called, and I actually have it. I bought it. I've had it actually for quite a few years. And it's another movie that's called The Toolbox Murders, but it's actually directed by one of my favorite directors, Tobe Hooper. And Tobe Hooper, anyone out there, if don't know who Tobe Hooper is, no offense, but you got to kind of get with the program. He famously directed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. One of the most iconic movies. I did a big show on Texas a couple of months ago. Definitely one of my all-time favorite movies of all time. Not just horror, or not just like horror, grindhouse sleazy, kind of a thing, but in general, just one of my all-time favorite movies. And I've talked about that movie a lot. So Tobe Hooper directed that. He also made a bunch of great films. Life Force, which is another, just such a great original, like it's essentially a vampire sci-fi movie. Super awesome. Definitely, I consider that to be in the kind of in the exploitation world also. Texas, I feel, definitely is in that world too, because of the grittiness of that whole aesthetic around that film, the low budget nature, and it feels like you're watching a documentary. He also did some other films that were more, I guess, commercial, but are actually really good. Poltergeist. He did that movie, which I think, obviously that's an amazing movie. A little bit more of a commercial movie. It was produced and I think co-written by Steven Spielberg, I believe, but it was directed by Tobe Hooper, which I always, when I have that on Blu-ray, Poltergeist, and I always that always kind of blew my mind when I found that out, the about the background of that movie, where you had Steven Spielberg, one of the one of the legends in cinema as a director, but he typically makes a lot of more popcorn oriented movies for families, but they're the tremendous movies. So I thought it was just an interesting, kind of strange collaboration that he collaborated with Tobe Hooper, who directed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is like one of the the grittiest, dirtiest horror movies ever made. and it has that, it has that big budget kind of Hollywood presentation, but you can see Toby Hooper's style in it. But awesome movie. Um, yeah, he's made so many great movies. The other one that I really love by Toby Hooper is Salem's Lot. That was a movie that I've talked a lot about before. I'll eventually do a show on that as well. And that was, of course, the classic adaptation from the Stephen King novel Salem's Lot. Toby Hooper also directed that movie, which that probably was the first vampire movie I saw as a kid that literally scared the crap out of me. That used to be on cable. That was, originally like almost like a TV movie. I believe it might have been. And that was a part of my youth, that movie. So, and I definitely saw that before. I didn't see Texas until much later. I didn't see that until I was probably in college, which is crazy. So Toby Hooper's made a lot of great movies, and then he also made the amazing sequel to Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part Two, which is such a great movie, so underrated, I think underappreciated, and it kind of gets a bad rap for being, I think, what Toby Hooper set out, because that the first one is so serious and so dark, and and psychological, and it's just really dirty and just raw, and it's serious. It's very serious. It's like an ultra serious movie. It feels like a documentary. And with the sequel, he made it almost into like a black comedy, and I love that he decided to not try to replicate the first one and do something completely different. And I think that the tone of that film throws people off because it's really silly. It's kind of got this really goofy '80s vibe to it, but it's still got a lot of those classic tropes from the first one. I love that movie. So I mean, so Toby Hooper, I think, is an iconic figure in the world of horror, and particularly with the emergence of kind of the more sleazy, underground, independent grindhouse aspects of cinema. Texas, one of the most influential movies of all time. And it's funny. So it's probably like 7 or 8 years ago. I was out somewhere and I found, and I have most of Toby Hooper's movies. I think I pretty much have all of them on DVD and Blu-ray. I have most of them on Blu-ray now. I have like literally 6 or 7 different copies of Texas. I have Life Force. I have Texas on DVD, VHS, and I have 2 or 3 copies of it on Blu-ray. I have copies, 1 or 2 copies of Texas 2 on Blu-ray and DVD. Life Force, I have a really great edition of that on Blu-ray. Poltergeist, I have a really good edition of that on Blu-ray. I don't own Salem's Lot. I don't have that on. I'm looking to find a really good like collector's edition that's got some special features on it, but I have not been able to find it. So about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, I was in the store. It might have been like the dollar store or something, and I came across this movie. It was the Toolbox Murders, and I saw, it was directed by Toby Hooper, so I was really excited. So when I saw that in the store, I was like, oh, Toby Hooper. He's one of my favorite horror directors. So I picked it up, and I realized that the movie was one of his later movies. I wasn't all that familiar because he recently, unfortunately, passed away about, I believe it was 2 or 3 years ago. And that was very sad because he was still pretty young and active. Later on in his career, he made a series of movies where I don't know, I'm not sure really what happened, but it felt like he was saying yes to lots of projects that were, uh, the feeling that I got, that they were just like paychecks. They were projects that he could still make money doing. They were still in the horror genre, but they weren't really very good. Pretty forgettable. I can't even really think. I've seen a few of the later movies. He directed a series of films in the 90s that were super low budget horror movies, but I don't know, they were pretty campy and just not really great. But it felt like they were just, it was a paycheck, and he, just kind of was doing these things to kind of sustain his career to a degree, which I always find amazing and surprising with certain directors. I've seen interviews with, well, one interview in particular with Quentin Tarantino where he was talking about some of his favorite directors and people that he felt, like one example that he talked about was Brian De Palma, or like Martin Scorsese's another one. And he was talking about, or even Ridley Scott is another director, where the whole idea of the show, he was talking about, consistency, and again, it's all a matter of opinion and taste, as from the viewer's perspective, or from being a fan of this body of work or of this director. But he was talking about, looking at, like, say, the career of Ridley Scott or Brian De Palma or, Spielberg, or he was talking about, mostly in this interview, talking about like Brian De Palma and Scorsese and and other directors too, were, Stanley Kubrick. But it's always interesting where, like, certain directors, like, I think generally it's really hard to find a movie, a bad movie that Stanley Kubrick directed. I think right up until the end, he was making just incredible work, and his body of work is just legendary. And I also feel like, say, with Scorsese, Martin Scorsese, same thing. I feel like his body of work is pretty tremendous. Even his like more recent films, I think like The Irishman is one of his best movies ever. I just think it's an incredible movie. But overall, I feel like he's got a real high level consistency to his work. Another director that I want to eventually get into is Akira Kurosawa, famous Japanese director, and he directed close to 100 movies. And even in his career, right up until he passed away, he was making some really great films. And Toby Hooper, and I feel like where Brian De Palma at one point was, one of the greatest directors ever. You know, Body Double, License to Kill, so many great movies. But and then also like Ridley Scott, he made some incredible films in the 70s and 80s that were just, legendary films. But at some point when it got into the later part of their career, and Brian De Palma doesn't really direct movies anymore. Scorsese is still very prolific. Ridley Scott is still very prolific. But something happened later in their career where suddenly it felt like the quality of things were going down, and it wasn't really about. It felt like it wasn't about their vision anymore. It just felt like maybe it was due to studio pressure, various other things, but it felt like it was going into that. I guess you could call it like the paycheck syndrome, where these incredible artists were kind of doing things, whether they had a bigger budget or a smaller budget. Like, I think, for instance, Brian De Palma, the later in his career, he got even more of a studio acceptance, or a bigger acceptance by bigger studios, and then also Ridley Scott. And it just felt like the focus and the clarity behind their vision just wasn't there, and the quality. And it just kind of, they put out, I feel, a lot of inconsistent films, not really great, not, a lot of clunkers in a lot of ways. And I don't know what that was due to. Like, the consistency just wasn't there. And I felt like Toby Hooper was in that same space of just kind of doing these things for paychecks. And so he made a series of films that were not so great. I came across the Two Box Murders, and I had it for a long time in my collection, and I never watched it for whatever reason. And then I remember a couple of years ago, I actually was going through my DVDs, and I was going through some movies that maybe I hadn't seen before, or, and again, I got it really cheap at like the dollar store or something on DVD. And one night I was going through my DVDs and going through stuff that, oh, maybe I don't think I've ever seen this. Picking out a couple of movies that maybe I had never seen, or maybe I'd only seen once. And so I ended up watching a Two Box Murders, and I only got about 45 minutes into it, and it was I thought it was pretty bad, and I couldn't really watch it. And I'm like, wow, like what happened? Like this is the same guy who made like Texas, and I'm like, it just felt like a real bad '90s horror movie. Not a really. The script was really clunky. The characters were not very great. The the atmosphere wasn't there. It just felt like everything was rushed. It had a minimal budget, and it was just kind of thrown together and kind of one of those movies that goes direct to video just to say it was done. So that was the impression that I got from it, and so I was never a big fan of that. Fast forward a couple of years, a couple of the guys that I watch on YouTube, one guy I always talk about a lot, Moods from he's a Canadian YouTube guy who's like my favorite guy, and he talks does all these great shows on all kinds of movies, but again, his specialty is the genre of exploitation and horror exploitation and B movies and really obscure movies. One of the movies he kept talking about and it kept coming up in different shows was the Toolbox Murders, and I kept thinking, wow, is he? So he's talking about that Toby Hooper movie, and I was like, really? Like, it's not really a great movie. I mean, he's got so many great movies. He's a legendary director, one of the greatest directors, in my book. So I was like, wow, he's talking about this movie. Why is this movie getting all this attention from him? And it's fine. It's a matter of opinion and taste. But the more I checked out his shows, he did like two or three shows where he mentioned the Toolbox Murders. I realized he was talking about this this movie with the same title that came out in the '70s, and that's when I realized, oh wait, there's an original, there's a different version of this movie, and then I realized, oh, this Toby Hooper version is a remake of the Toolbox Murders, and I was like, huh, that's crazy. I had no idea. I had no idea. So about a year or two ago, I was in the store at Bull Moose, and I saw the Toolbox Murders on Blu-ray, and I was like, oh, this is it. This is the one. And I've only seen this once, and I was blown away by this movie. It is so great. It's so damn good. The Toby Hooper remake, felt like it didn't resemble really anything. The only thing I remember, it kind of the story, everything was totally different. It was just, they had this mass killer, and it was kind of a slasher movie, but the setting was different. It just seemed really different, but it was a remake. And this movie just like totally blew it out of the water. And it's just like from 1978. Super sleazy. It's really gritty. It's dirty. Total exploitation. Just to on 11. And I was like, this movie is so awesome. And I couldn't believe that I had never seen this movie before. And this edition is great. There's like really a lot of great special features on here. The transfer of this on Blu-ray is spectacular. The music is just great. It's definitely like a slasher film, like a super kind of like a really sleazy slasher film. But I think it's one of the best, and it's amazing that this came out in like '78, like you know over 40 years ago. Like that's just nuts, and it totally holds the test of time. Just a tremendous movie, and it's kind of gone on to be one of my favorite slasher exploitation movies. And it's funny because Dennis Donnelly, who directed this film, after this film, he didn't really direct too many movies. I don't believe after this, but he became a big name. He started directing all these TV shows in the '80s because this came out in '78, and this movie, I believe, it was successful. It was definitely in the grindhouse circuit. It played a lot of theaters for a while, and it did have like it has a huge cult following. But it's definitely not a commercial movie by any means. I mean, it's pretty raw. It's pretty raw, and it's pretty low down and dirty. But it definitely had, I believe that it made quite a bit of money for what it was, and it's very popular now with all of. And this is also put out by Blue Underground. If you can see probably can't see the label. But Blue Underground, I've talked about before. I've done reviews on a lot of their releases. Blue Underground is one of probably my favorite company, and that's owned by Bill Leswig, well, also another one of my favorite directors who's done Maniac, which is probably my all-time favorite slasher exploitation movie. I did a show on that. Um, just an amazing director, and he kind of more or less retired from filmmaking, and he started this company, Blue Underground. So this edition of Toolbox, the Toolbox Murders, was released on it. But the funny thing is, Dennis Donnelly, like he never really made. As far as I know, and from what I've read, he hasn't. He never really became. He never really released too many more films, but he became a real big name in the television world in the '80s. And looking up like the movies that he or the TV shows he was responsible for, I just think it's hilarious. He made TV shows such as The Guilt, another real famous TV show that I used to watch as a kid all the time, Riptide from 1984, like a super cheesy kind of action TV show. I believe it was like on CBS. He also made Airwolf, which was another television show. Riptide, I remember, was like a really big show. He also did The Rousters, which was another show that came out in '83. Another show, I believe it was a movie, Whiz Kids, which is hilarious, 1983. Another TV show, Hardcastle and McCormick. Like that was another one that I remember seeing on cable all the time as a kid. He was also responsible for the A Team, which is crazy. And then another one, Simon and Simon, which I remember that also being another, kind of thing I would see all the time on cable as a kid. It's just, and he also went on to direct Falcon Crest, like the soap opera TV show. Enos, he directed California Fever, and it's to me it's just wild that like he made this, with the Toolbox Murders being like his first, venture into filmmaking, and it's such a gritty, dirty, sleazy movie, and he went on to make all of these like super uber commercial kind of white bread American television shows that were really popular and huge. And I just think it's funny that like hilarious that he went from this you know from this like real sleazy world to making like these slices of like American pie. He made Heart to Heart, which was another show, hilarious. That came out in '79. Project UFO, Dallas, which was one of the biggest TV shows at one point. It was right up there with like Knots Landing and all the soap opera shows. All of those series like Dallas, Knots Landing. The A Team was a show I used to watch all the time as a kid. I love that. So yeah, I just think it's hilarious that he went from that. He also directed The Amazing Spider-Man, a television show. I mean, he did so many television shows. It's astounding. The Man from Atlantis, Charlie's Angels. He was also responsible for Charlie's Angels, which came out in 1976, which was a huge show. They've made 3 or 4 different movies off of that fairly recently. Barney B. Jones, I remember that show. Emergency. The list goes on and on. Adam 12. He also directed a bunch of Hawaii Five O shows, which is wild. Just wild. Like so it's always interesting when you find these directors that still are in it. They might make one or two movies that make a statement, and where they find an audience, or maybe is even like a big huge box office success, and seeing where they go after that, or if they stick with making films, or they get into other things. But apparently he didn't do that. He went straight into television and was a huge star. I mean, he was responsible for some of the biggest television shows in the '80s. I mean, you think of the A Team. I mean, that's like synonymous. Like that's '80s right there. I mean, who doesn't know of that? So really funny. So But I totally recommend The Toolbox Murders, 1978. This movie is just so awesome on so many levels, and particularly if you get this edition, it's one of the greatest exploitation movies ever. So this is Jason Dean. Thanks again for all the support. If you like these videos, please take the time and like and subscribe to my videos. Stay tuned for some more shows, and we will see you next time. Peace.